The year is 1580, and you're crouched behind ornate marble pillars watching as dozens of women move through corridors that shimmer with gold and precious stones. These aren't ordinary women living ordinary lives. These are the inhabitants of the Ottoman imperial harem, existing within walls that conceal secrets more bizarre and controlling than anything you could imagine. Every gesture they make, every word they speak, every breath they take is governed by rules so intricate and suffocating that they would make a modern person question what it truly means to be human. You watch as a young woman approaches a doorway, then suddenly stops. She waits, counting silently to herself before taking exactly 7 steps backward, turning her head precisely 45 degrees to the left, and only then proceeding forward. This isn't madness. This is survival. These are the invisible chains that bound hundreds of women within the most powerful empire on earth, transforming their daily existence into elaborate performances where a single mistake could mean exile, punishment, or worse. The air is heavy with rose oil and frankincense, carrying whispered conversations in a dozen languages as women navigate a world where every action has been choreographed by centuries of tradition. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of control and resistance, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know what historical mysteries intrigue you most. It's incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different corners of the world, connected by our shared fascination with the complexities of human experience. The first rule that governed life in the harem was perhaps the most psychologically devastating of all. Women were forbidden from speaking above a whisper during daylight hours. This wasn't about maintaining peace or showing respect. It was about the systematic erasure of individual identity through the control of the most basic human expression. Every conversation became a careful negotiation with silence. Every emotion filtered through the constraint of enforced quiet. Imagine the mental strain of constantly monitoring your own voice, of never being able to express joy, frustration, or pain at its natural volume. Laughter had to be muffled behind silk scarves. Arguments became deadly serious games of controlled whispers. Even singing, one of the few pleasures allowed within these walls, had to be performed so softly that only the singer herself could truly hear the melody. But here's where the true horror begins. The silence wasn't just about volume. Specially trained attendants were positioned throughout the harem to monitor not just how loudly women spoke, but what they said. Every whispered word was catalogued, analysed, and reported to senior officials who maintained detailed records of each woman's conversations, opinions, and emotional state. Privacy became impossible when even the quietest expression of thought was subject to surveillance and interpretation. The psychological impact was devastating. Women learned to communicate through elaborate systems of gestures, facial expressions, and coded phrases that allowed them to maintain human connection while avoiding the constant threat of punishment. Their voices became precious resources that could only be used sparingly, making every whispered word carry enormous emotional weight. The second rule involved the harem's dress code, and it reveals the obsessive control that extended to every aspect of personal appearance. Women weren't simply required to dress modestly. Instead, their clothing had to follow complex regulations that determined not just what fabrics they could wear, but which colors were appropriate for different times of day, seasons, and social occasions within the harem walls. The regulations were incredibly detailed. Mourning garments had to be constructed from silk that had been dyed with specific plant extracts and blessed by religious authorities. Afternoon clothing required different fabrics, different cuts, and different decorative elements that supposedly reflected the changing spiritual energy of the day. Evening wear followed yet another set of requirements that balanced modesty with the need to maintain attractiveness for potential imperial attention. But the madness didn't stop with basic clothing requirements. The accessories, jewelry, and even undergarments were subject to elaborate rules that varied based on a woman's position within the harem hierarchy, her age, her country of origin, and her current standing with palace authorities. Every morning became an exercise in complex decision-making as women navigated regulations that could change without notice based on political developments or religious interpretations. The enforcement was ruthless. Teams of senior women conducted daily inspections that examined every aspect of each person's appearance. The fabric quality, the stitching patterns, the color combinations, and the overall presentation were all subject to professional evaluation. Women who failed these inspections faced punishments that ranged from public humiliation to loss of privileges that made life within the harem even more difficult. The third rule governed movement within the harem spaces, and it demonstrates the elaborate choreography that controlled every aspect of daily life. Women couldn't simply walk from one room to another as they pleased. Instead, their movement had to follow predetermined routes that had been calculated to minimize contact between different groups while maintaining appropriate social distances based on rank and status. The pathway system was incredibly complex. Different corridors were designated for use at different times of day, with some routes reserved for senior women, others for newcomers, and still others for women who held special positions within the harem hierarchy. The timing of movement was strictly regulated, with specific hours allocated for different activities and different groups of women. Navigation required careful planning and constant awareness. Women had to memorize complex schedules that determined when they could access different areas of the harem, which routes they were permitted to use, and how long they could remain in each location. The psychological pressure was enormous, as getting lost or taking a wrong turn could result in accusations of deliberate disobedience or suspicious behavior. The enforcement mechanism was particularly cruel. Senior women were positioned at key intersections to monitor movement patterns and ensure compliance with the elaborate routing system. These monitors maintained detailed logs of who traveled where and when, creating a surveillance network that made spontaneous movement impossible and transformed simple navigation into a form of constant performance. The fourth rule involved the harem's meal times, and it reveals the control that extended even to the most basic human need for nourishment. Women weren't allowed to eat whenever they felt hungry, or to choose their own food based on personal preferences. Instead, their nutrition was managed according to complex systems that balanced religious requirements, medical theories, and social hierarchies. The meal schedule was incredibly rigid. Different groups of women ate at different times, using different dining areas, and consuming different types of food based on their position within the harem social structure. The timing was calculated not just for practical purposes, but to reinforce status differences and maintain appropriate social boundaries between different categories of women. Food preparation followed elaborate protocols that went far beyond basic cooking. The ingredients had to be sourced from approved suppliers, prepared by specially trained cooks who had undergone religious purification rituals, and served using utensils and dishes that had been blessed according to Islamic requirements. Every meal became a religious ceremony that required the participation of multiple specialists. The psychological impact was profound. Women couldn't respond to natural hunger cues or enjoy the simple pleasure of choosing their own meals. Instead, they had to participate in elaborate dining rituals that treated nutrition as another aspect of imperial control rather than basic human need. Their bodies became property of the state, managed according to official policies rather than personal requirements. The fifth rule concerned personal hygiene, and it demonstrates the religious obsessions that governed every aspect of physical maintenance. Women couldn't simply clean themselves according to personal preferences or practical considerations. Instead, their hygiene routines had to follow elaborate protocols that combined Islamic purification requirements with superstitious beliefs about spiritual cleanliness. The purification process was incredibly detailed and time-consuming. Different parts of the body had to be cleansed using specific techniques, materials, and prayers that were believed to remove not just physical dirt, but spiritual contamination that could affect the entire harem community. The ritual nature of cleansing transformed basic hygiene into religious performance that required constant attention and professional oversight. As we stand now in these same shadowed corridors where our journey began, watching the ghostly figures of women who lived and died within these golden walls, we begin to understand that the strange rules of the Ottoman harem were never really about protection or honor. They were about the systematic transformation of human beings into instruments of imperial power, where every private moment became subject to state control and every personal need became a matter of governmental policy. The women who navigated these impossible circumstances weren't passive victims. They were survivors who found ways to preserve their humanity within a system designed to erase their individuality. The sixth rule involved the harem's communication with the outside world, revealing the complete isolation that these women endured. Contact with family members, friends, or anyone beyond the palace walls was strictly forbidden, except through elaborate channels that filtered every message through multiple layers of official oversight. Letters couldn't be written freely or sent directly. Instead, any communication had to be composed according to approved formats, reviewed by palace censors, and delivered through official messengers who reported on the content and emotional tone of every exchange. The psychological cruelty of this isolation was staggering. Mothers were separated from their children, sisters from their families, and daughters from their parents, often forever. The women learned to create new kinship networks within the harem walls, forming bonds that became their only source of emotional support and human connection. These relationships became lifelines in a world where natural family ties had been severed by imperial decree. The seventh rule governed sleep and rest, transforming even unconsciousness into a matter of state control. Women weren't allowed to sleep whenever they felt tired or to arrange their sleeping quarters according to personal comfort. Instead, their rest was managed according to complex schedules that balanced security concerns with social hierarchies and religious requirements. Sleeping arrangements reflected the rigid status system that governed all aspects of harem life. Senior women enjoyed private quarters with comfortable furnishings, while newcomers shared cramped spaces with multiple roommates. The timing of sleep was strictly regulated, with designated hours for rest that couldn't be adjusted based on individual needs or preferences. Guards maintained constant surveillance even during sleeping hours, ensuring that women remained in their assigned locations and didn't attempt unauthorized communication or movement. The eighth rule involved pregnancy and childbirth, areas where one might expect some relaxation of the harsh regulations. Instead, these most intimate aspects of women's lives became subjects of intense official interest and control. Pregnant women were monitored constantly by palace physicians who documented every aspect of their condition, from dietary habits to emotional states to physical changes that might indicate the health of the developing child. The birth process itself was managed according to elaborate protocols that prioritized the potential value of the child to the imperial dynasty over the comfort or safety of the mother. Religious authorities, medical specialists, and court officials all participated in ceremonies that treated childbirth as a state event rather than a personal experience. Women had no control over who attended their deliveries, what medical interventions were performed, or how their children would be raised after birth. The ninth rule concerned education and intellectual development, revealing the complex attitudes toward women's minds within the imperial system. While some harem residents received extensive education in languages, arts, and religious studies, this learning was carefully controlled and directed toward imperial purposes rather than personal fulfillment. Women could become highly educated, but only within narrow parameters that served the dynasty's interests. The curriculum was strictly regulated by palace authorities, who determined which subjects were appropriate, which teachers were qualified, and which materials could be studied. Mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy were often forbidden as potentially dangerous to social order, while music, poetry, and religious studies were encouraged because they enhanced a woman's value without challenging imperial authority. Intelligence became another asset to be managed and directed rather than a personal quality to be developed freely. The 10th rule involved death and burial, demonstrating how imperial control extended even beyond life itself. Women who died within the harem couldn't be mourned according to their own cultural traditions or buried according to their family's wishes. Instead, their deaths became state events, managed according to palace protocols that prioritized imperial dignity over personal grief or religious observance. The burial process reflected the woman's status within the harem hierarchy rather than her personal achievements or character. Senior women received elaborate funerals with religious ceremonies and permanent grave markers, while lower-ranking women were buried in unmarked graves with minimal ceremony. Even in death, their individual identities remained subordinate to their roles within the imperial system. These rules weren't just historical curiosities or examples of ancient oppression. They represent a systematic approach to human control that transformed individual women into instruments of imperial power through the regulation of every aspect of daily life. The women who survived these conditions developed remarkable resilience and created forms of resistance that preserved their humanity despite impossible circumstances. They developed secret languages that allowed them to communicate complex emotions through seemingly innocent gestures. They created underground networks of support that provided emotional sustenance when official channels offered only surveillance and control. They found ways to preserve their cultural identities through hidden rituals and private ceremonies that kept alive the memories of lives they had left behind. The women who lived within these walls weren't just victims of an oppressive system. They were human beings who found extraordinary ways to maintain their dignity, their relationships, and their sense of self, despite circumstances designed to destroy all three. They turned enforced silence into opportunities for deeper communication. They transformed restricted movement into carefully choreographed forms of resistance. They converted supervised meals into moments of community building that transcended the hierarchies imposed upon them. The harem's strange rules reveal something profound about the nature of power itself. The more absolute the control, the more elaborate the systems required to maintain it. Every regulation we've explored today was a response to the fundamental truth that human beings cannot be completely controlled, no matter how comprehensive the attempt. The women's resilience forced the imperial system to create increasingly complex mechanisms of surveillance and punishment, which in turn created new opportunities for subtle forms of resistance. These forgotten stories matter because they remind us that throughout history, people have found ways to preserve their humanity, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The women of the Ottoman harem created forms of solidarity and resistance that allowed them to survive conditions that would have broken many others. They developed psychological strategies that protected their inner lives from external control. They built communities that provided meaning and purpose within systems designed to reduce them to mere objects. Their experiences also reveal the costs of absolute power, not just for those who suffer under it, but for the entire society that supports such systems. The elaborate rules that governed harem life required enormous resources, constant surveillance, and the participation of hundreds of officials whose lives were also constrained by the need to maintain impossible levels of control. The system that oppressed these women also trapped their oppressors in webs of protocol and procedure that made genuine human connection nearly impossible for everyone involved. As we step back from these shadowed corridors and return to our modern world, we carry with us the voices of women who found ways to speak despite enforced silence, who maintained their dignity despite systematic humiliation, and who preserved their humanity despite every attempt to reduce them to instruments of imperial will. Their stories remind us that the human spirit possesses remarkable powers of adaptation and resistance that can survive even the most comprehensive attempts at control. The strange rules of the Ottoman harem weren't just about governing women's behavior. They were about the fundamental question of what it means to be human in a world where power seeks to control every aspect of human experience. The women who lived and died within these walls answered that question through their daily acts of survival, resistance, and community building that proved the impossibility of completely controlling the human heart. Their legacy lives on, not in the golden walls that confine them, but in the countless small acts of courage, creativity, and connection that allowed them to remain human despite everything. These are the true treasures of the imperial harem, more valuable than all the jewels and silks that decorated their prison, because they represent the indestructible core of human dignity that no system of control can ever fully extinguish.